All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Professional Development Series hosted by the Graduate School here at Wayne State. This is our first event of 2023, and I'm excited to kick things off again for, I believe this is my sixth semester working these events. So it's really exciting to still be here and to be a part of this esteemed event series. My name is Nick Matar. For those of you who may not be familiar with me, I am the Director of Marketing at the Graduate School. I am also a part-time faculty member at the Mike Illitz School of Business. And I mentioned that second part because one of my colleagues there is actually our speaker today, who's going to speak on the role of unions in the workplace. And that is Marick Masters. He is a professor of business at Wayne State. And he seems to be the university's go-to person to talk to the media on all things related to labor relations, unions in general in the media. So I'll kick it over to him in just a moment. A couple really quick administrative things before we start. First off, if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them in the meeting chat. I will be monitoring those and we'll be sure to moderate that with Marick after the fact, as soon as he's done presenting. And then as well, we'll open up the floor to Q&A when we are finished as well. Right now, we're in focus mode here through the Zoom, so you'll only be able to see him and in the slides. But you will be able to raise your hand and ask questions when we're done as well. So without further ado, Marick, I will kick it over to you.
Well, thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. And I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time this afternoon. The title of my presentation is Labor Unions and Collective Bargaining in the United States. This is an overview. It's really a survey of some labor relations topics that I think will give you a bit of a primer on the state of labor relations, the state of unions, and the state of collective bargaining in the United States. There's a fair amount of data in my, see if this, I can get this to move forward. We'll cover an overview of the industrial relations system. We'll talk a little bit about union membership and differentiate that from recognition, which really has a lot of implications more internationally than it does for the US, but it's an important distinction. Talk a little bit about laws and regulations, a little bit about collective bargaining agreements, wages and benefits, strikes, organizing, and public opinion. And as Nick said, if you have questions, put them in the chat and he will ask them. I asked him, if there are really points of clarification or things I can help you with that are urgent, to just go ahead and interrupt and ask, and we'll cover them on the spot. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end. This is a simplified version of John Dunlap, former Secretary of Labor, Harvard professor, wrote a book published in the late 1950s called Industrial Relations Systems. It's sort of a path-breaking book in the field. And it focused our attention on the environmental context of industrial relations, which include, the labor market, the product market, the budgetary situation facing organizations, be they in the private or public sector, technology, and the distribution of power in society between labor and capital. The parties to the system include workers and their unions, management in their various capacities, some of which may operate through associations of employers, and government, which can regulate what goes on in the private sector as well as in the public sector. And then the output is the what we call the rules of the workplace. And they can include such things as collective bargaining agreements. And they cover a variety of topics which are classified into items dealing with terms and conditions of employment, such as wages and benefits. In terms of union membership by industry, this graph shows you how it's changed since 1973. And you can see that if you look at the blue line, that is total union membership in the United States, that in the early 70s, it was in the neighborhood of 25% of the workforce. That's declined to now it is just 10% of the workforce overall. And the workforce includes about 140 million people. If you look at the manufacturing sector, which in the heyday of labor in the 1950s in the United States, was a bastion of union strength. In the early 1970s, you had about 40%. When we think about unions, we think often of the United Auto Workers from Detroit. They're headquartered in Detroit, and their history is rich in the state of Michigan as an industrial union representing workers primarily in auto, but also in aerospace, agriculture, and now in the public sector, including such areas as teaching and nursing in higher ed. And that's gone down to now it is about 8% of the workforce in the manufacturing sector that's unionized. If you look at the overall private sector, which means everything but government, that has gone down to now just a little bit above, actually just at 6% of the private sector workforce is unionized. And conversely, in the public sector, you've seen an uptick in that, at least in the early part of this period, but it's leveled off at about 35%. Thereabouts since then. The decline in unions is the major story of labor in the United States over the past several decades. And you can look at this at your leisure. There's a lot of data in here, but I recently have written a book, which is coming out soon, on trade union finances. And I looked at the finances of the 53 largest unions in the United States. And I include here their membership based on averages over a 2-year cycle between the years 2006 through 2007, 2018 through 19. And you can see the range. These 53 unions include over 18 million members. Now, this includes retirees as well as active members who are currently working. So it's a little bit of an inflated number when you compare it to statistics that just look at the current workplace. If you want to get an idea of how wealthy unions are, this will show you their total and net assets. And this are the 53 unions. At the international level, it does not include regional unions or local unions. And you can figure there's about as much money in regional and local unions combined as there is in the internationals. But you have over $10 billion and these are in current dollars, not real dollars, but over $10 billion in total assets and about $8 billion in net assets at the present time. Now that seems like a lot of money in and of itself, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what companies have. So there is no way that unions can compete with businesses in terms of money. And companies spend a lot of money to resist unions. That's one of the reasons why they're only 6% of the private sector workforce. Companies in the United States have no love loss for unions. They tend not to want to have unions, even if they're socially responsible, quote unquote. Otherwise, they will fight tooth and nail to keep unions out. This has, their receipts. You can see that they $7.5 billion in the latter part of this time frame of 14 years. And member-based income is the amount of money that they raise from their rank and file. Unions can generate money in a lot of different ways. Some of them operate businesses. Some of them sell insurance, health insurance, life insurance. Some of them sell credit cards, or they subsidize credit cards that you buy through the union. Some of them have businesses which, the rental property they rent, and they derive rental income from that. But they have upward of $33.8 billion in member-based income. And that has outpaced, this has been really a fortunate development for labor unions. It's outpaced the money that they've had to spend on their operating budgets. So that has given them a cushion during what have been hard times of membership losses, particularly during the Great Recession era, which occurred in roughly 2008 and 9 and 10. You can look at this for those of you that are international. You can see the comparison of US. They call it union density. It's the percentage of union membership in the workforce across countries. And you can see the United States has a relatively low percentage of membership. Then it was in 2018 to 19, about 11 to 12% over this time period. It's less than that now. This is actual membership. It's not representation or recognition, which is a little bit different. Recognition is just those who you represent for collective bargaining purposes, and not everybody in the US who is part of a bargaining unit has to join a union. You're in the public sector, and so if you are represented by a union, as you are the Federation of Teachers, you don't have to join that union. That's a result of a Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago called Janus versus AFSCME, and had upheld the right of workers to refuse to join a union and not be compelled to do so or pay dues. The composition give you a breakdown of there are over 14 million union members in the workplace today. These are people actually working. They break down, they're 54% men, 45% women, white over 75%, black 15%, Asian 6%, Hispanic a little over 16%. Full-time is over 91%, with the rest being part-time workers represented. There's a part-time union in Wayne State, so you can understand and appreciate that. Represents part-time instructors. There are a variety of laws which cover the public and private sector. I've highlighted some of the salient ones. In the public sector, you have the Civil Service Reform Act, which covers federal employees. If you're talking about people that work for the Center for Disease Control, the Internal Revenue Service, the U.S. Department of Defense on the civilian side, or the Department of Education, those individuals may be represented by unions in the federal service. You also have the Postal Reorganization Act. Most postal workers, the people that deliver your mail for the U.S. Postal Service, they are separate from the FedEx drivers and from the UPS drivers, but they are unionized. And the people that work in their offices, if you go to a postal office to deliver a package or pick up a package, those are represented most likely by the American Postal Workers Union. And then you have a host of state and local public sector bargaining laws. Across the 50 states, you have more than 40 of them with their own distinctive laws, which to varying degrees cover firefighters, police, and teachers. More about that in the next table. And then in the private sector, You have the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 as amended by the Labor Management Relations Act in 1947, commonly called the Taft-Hartley Act. And then in 1959, you had the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, commonly called the Landon-Griffin Act of 1959, and the Railway Labor Act, which covers the airline industry and the railroad industry in the U.S. If you're looking at states, there are a handful of states which make it illegal for their public employees, that is, their firefighters, police, and teachers, to unionize. For example, among teachers in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, it's not legal to unionize, although sometimes they may form unions and attempt to have some sort of representation. It's legal among teachers, for example, in 44 states in the District of Columbia to unionize teachers. And Arizona is a state which doesn't have a statute in this regard. But one of the things that unions do when they get recognition, if they're formally recognized as a bargaining agent of workers, they will attempt to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement where they will embed the so-called rules of the workplace about wages, hours, schedules, benefits, management rights, on down the line of other items that may be included. And generally speaking, unionized workers earn more than non-union workers, and you can see that in this median weekly earnings of full-time and salary workers by their union affiliation. It's broken down between men and women, racial categories as well. So you can see that generally speaking, across these various categories, that the unionized workers benefit from their representation in terms of having higher wages than their non-union counterparts. And the same thing applies to benefits. They're more likely to have certain benefits like healthcare and retirement than those who are non-union. If you look at strikes, you can see that there are only a handful of strikes today. These are major strikes of 1,000 or more employees. There are many more strikes that are smaller in number, which exceed these in number, but they're not huge numbers, even across the whole U.S. economy. In any given year, you may have 1,000 strikes at most that take place that are very small and may only involve 10, 15 people, 50 people, as well as a handful today that involve more than 1,000 workers in each bargaining unit. And you had about 22 of those in 2022, which was an uptick from what happened earlier. There was a great deal made about that by some, but I really don't think it's that big a deal. There's still very, very minimal strike activity. And unions get recognition to achieve recognition in the private and in the public sector. In the private sector, primarily under the National Labor Relations Act, which is administered by the NLRB, labeled the National Labor Relations Board, which is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And here between 1953 and 2021, you see the total number of elections that are held each year. It may seem like a lot in number. If you look, for example, the peak was in early 1970s when you had over 9,400 elections. In 2000, you had 980. There was an uptick of that to about 1,470 something in 2022. That seems like a lot of number that garnered a lot of attention, and people said, well, unions are on the rise. My sense is that you should hit the pause button before you get to your fork over that change, because it represents only a handful of workers, as this next table shows. Look at the data from 2020 when you had 980 elections. There were only 60,000 workers involved in those elections. And out of a workforce of 140 million, that's a drop in the bucket. If unions had to rely on this method to organize, they would be falling behind each year. They probably lose through attrition, layoffs, and other things about 1 million members a year that they have to replace. And then they have to make up for the gain in the size of the workforce that accretes annually due to the additional people that enter, that is higher in number than those who exit the labor force. So unions will lag behind if they're not able to raise generate more members than 60,000 through elections. In terms of getting you an idea of why there's a focus on unions, why some people say, well, unions are going to rise, they're on the rise again. One of the reasons is that up until very recently, median real wages have been stagnant. Look at these numbers. You think about it, from roughly 1979, when the median weekly real earnings of a worker was a little bit over $330. Fast forward, more than 40 years. In 2020, that was just $380. So over a 40+ year period, the weekly wages in real dollars for the typical worker just went up about a little over $45. That is very small in number. During the pandemic, the number came down, and it's gone down, and the real number of wages has gone down because inflation has jumped to above 6% from a low level of 2% up until 2022, in which it for a variety of different reasons began to accelerate. But you probably read a lot and heard a lot about organizing in some major US companies. There was a big win that the Amazon Labor Union, which is a grassroots union that rose up among the Amazon warehouse workers and successfully organized a facility in Staten Island, New York, of about 8,000 members in the latter part of last year. And that was heralded as a big win for unions. Now, they had another election for another warehousing site, and they lost that in the New York State area. But nonetheless, it's considered to be a breakthrough. And you probably heard a lot about organizing at Starbucks, and indeed the Workers United, which is affiliated with the Service Employees International Union, which in turn is affiliated with the AFL-CIO. They have been organizing Starbucks sites. And you have people that have been trying to organize as well, the workers at Apple, with some different unions involved in that. But if you look at what's going on in Starbucks, and this has probably generated the most media attention, people were saying, well, this is a sign of the transformation in the labor unions that, and they've been very adept at organizing and deserve a lot of credit for it. But you have to organize each Starbucks store by store. So you may only have 20, 30 people that work at a given store. You may have less than that. And they've got to organize a large number to make a dent in Starbucks, which has thousands of retail sites. So even though over the past 18 months or so, you've had a large number of elections in which the union has won 273. These data are about a month old. That only amounts to a total of 7,100 employees. Now, not all of these have necessarily been joined a union. They can be represented by a union. And I don't think that a single contract has been negotiated at this point in time. There could be a contract that there are probably many in the works. There could be one or two, a handful that have been done. But when a union gets recognition, it still has to negotiate a contract. And for unions that are relatively inexperienced, those people, at a work site, to sit down with management and what management will do is it will bring in its cadre of lawyers. Starbucks will bring in its corporate lawyers to sit down with the store manager and negotiate a contract with the employees who, may have some representation from a larger union, but could be at a disadvantage in terms of their expertise and background and experience in the area. This is sort of a map of where the elections and petitions to hold elections have been filed in Starbucks. You can see how they're distributed across the United States. Heavy concentration in the Northeast, I would say the West Coast. And you would expect this. There's more union fermentation, I think, in those areas than you have in others. We're getting to the end of the formal presentation here. When you look at public opinion of unions, it has been this historically high before. Actually, the most recent one, 2022, is about 70% approval, which is close to what it was in the early 1960s, a little bit less than it was in the early 1950s, but certainly more than it was in 2010, which was sort of at the nadir or low point of public approval of unions in the United States. But that 68% people say, that's a lot of support for unions. Well, this is generic survey data taken by the Gallup organization. There's a big leap between people responding to a generic poll about support for unions and actually voting for a union on their own work site. Even a company like Starbucks, which is regarded as being socially responsible and a little bit forward-looking, it has taken a firm position against union representation and is involved in several court cases now, in which it's being challenged by the union representing workers for unfair labor practices, and it in turn has challenged the union with unfair labor practices. So even though you will stop on this high note and say that there seems to be a lot of support for unions, that hasn't translated into membership on the ground. Unions are a very small percentage of the workforce, and that has tremendous implications for their overall economic position and their overall economic political power. And I think, when you really compare them to businesses, particularly those that are larger, they lack the resources. If you look at the political arena, for example, in any given election cycle, which is a 2-year election cycle, companies will pour in, a couple of $1 billion into financing federal campaigns, those people that run for Congress and president. Unions will spend a few $100 million. And so they are swamped by corporate resources, and companies have the resources to hire attorneys, to fight organizing efforts, and they will fight them in many instances tooth and nail, sometimes using tactics that some say are illegal or approach the line, if not crossing the line of legality, and make it difficult for people to want to exercise their right to support a union in the workplace. I'll sort of close on that. This has been a survey. And I'll be happy to respond to any questions that people might have. My contact information is available for people if they want to follow up afterwards with any questions. Just send me an email. I'll be happy to respond. So I'll turn things over to you now, Nick.
All right. Yeah, and thank you so much for that presentation. And if anybody has questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or I will stop the focus mode so you can also come on to the screen as well and share your thoughts. I did have a question just to begin with. You had a slide earlier that looked at international numbers, and you had a bunch of countries, and it looked like, looking at the last column, there were only 3 countries with numbers. Is that just a data issue, or did unions just like disappear from the face of the earth?
No, it's a data issue. It's these numbers, you collect them by country. These numbers are from the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation. The International Labor Organization collects its own data. Countries vary in terms of how frequently they report it, and these umbrella organizations vary in terms of how frequently they collect it and publish it in a document that's publicly available. So I took the latest data that was publicly available from their website. So it isn't that they disappeared, although in some countries, membership has gone down significantly because of changes in the law, but since that 2018 time period, but it's not due to any sea change in developments. It's just that it hasn't been reported or hasn't been collected by that umbrella organization.
Got it. And is there anything specific that you would attribute on this last slide, something like a dip in the approval? I see in 2009 it was down to about 48%. I'm guessing that related somewhat to the recession, but is there anything that you found
it was
to be a
2000? That was 2010, I believe. It might have been 2009, but that was during the recession. That was also corresponded with the rise in the Tea Party. And if you recall the midterm elections of 2010, in which the Republicans swept the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and also won elections in many state legislatures and governorships. If you recall, remember when Wisconsin was going to change its public sector bargaining law, and you had the sit-in demonstrations and the efforts to block the legislature, and the legislature fleeing essentially so that they couldn't hold a session, and going to Illinois. And there were all kinds of activities to block the efforts to enact anti-union legislation. That was during that time period. I think that people had a lot of negative attitudes towards government, and they took it out at that time, and it reflected in a dip in support for unions.
Got it. Yeah, and this was really some interesting data that you shared. And to whoever had asked in the chat, yes, we are going to send out the slides. We'll send out an email tomorrow when the video is up, and we'll send the video as well as the slides to attendees. So you have those, you can always go back and watch this as well. If any questions are out there, please feel free to, you either use the raise hand feature, or you can just hop off of mute and go ahead and ask your question yourself. I did see a couple that were private chats over to me. One other question that I saw specifically was a question about kind of like how did unions really start so many years ago? There's stories about how unions are so how they can trace their roots back to Detroit, but I'm wondering how that did happen. And I know that that's a long story, but I don't know if you could sum it up in
Well,
a
you know,
minute
give
or
you a
two.
thumbnail sketch. Unions really started among craft workers in the early 19th century. This was really before the Industrial Revolution. So you had people that engaged in certain trades that organized to improve their position with their employers. And so once the Industrial Revolution took hold and you had more people working in the assembly line, and this really gained some momentum during the Civil War era, in which there was a lot of organizing among those that produced at munitions plants and other things that supported the war effort. You had efforts on the part of workers to regulate the hours of work, provide for some sort of, you might say, a living wage or a better wage than what was possible. Labor unions fluctuated very widely in terms of membership. They would have spikes. They were often associated with very active social movements that were fleeting in nature. And they might rise during relatively good economic times and then deflate during bad economic times when there was a recession with a lot of unemployment. But by the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, they began to stabilize, and they had periods of growth and decline in the early part of that century, but there really wasn't a general labor law that protected the right to organize. That didn't take place until the Railway Labor Act covered railroad workers and airline workers in the early in 1926. And then you had the Labor Relations Act of 1939. And there was a lot of organizing in auto at that point in time in the Detroit area. And the auto workers were formed during that time period. And they survived a very turbulent emergence in which they were challenged by employers, and there was a lot of internal divisions between socialists, communists, and more conservative elements of the labor movement at that time. But through the National Labor Relations Act and the rights that people were accorded, there was a significant growth in unions in the late 1930s. Even more significant growth during World War II. Some of that was a result of the sort of social compact between labor and business and government at that time period. But labor's unions peaked in the United States really with most of its membership concentrated in the private sector, a lot of it concentrated in the manufacturing sector in the early 1950s, in which about 35% of the workforce was unionized. That was almost all private sector. And since then, private sector union membership has declined. In the late 1950s, public sector, your government workers, your teachers, your firefighters, your police officers, and your civil service workers, people who work for your municipalities and the welfare department, public works department, that kind of thing, they started unionizing. There were a flurry of states that passed public sector bargaining laws in the 1960s. Federal government sort of paved the way in the early 1960s. President Kennedy signed an executive order granting federal employees the right to unionize, although they don't have the same rights that other public sector workers do in terms of scope of bargaining over wages and that kind of thing. But there was an increase in the 60s and 70s in public sector membership to where I showed in that graph to, roughly about 35% or so of the public sector workforce, that's federal, state, and local, was unionized and has been unionized for quite some time. But it's continued to drop since the early 1950s in the private sector to where now you have just 6%. And that's been attributed to a number of different reasons, including structural changes in the economy, the move away from manufacturing to service, the exportation of certain jobs, offshoring, and a very, very strong resistance on the part of employers and more sophistication in terms of how they resist unions. So all of those things combined have made it difficult to organize. And I think part of the blame also has to lie with unions that they got complacent. They really didn't try very hard for a long period of time to organize. They didn't care that much. And their organizations became, I think, a little bit ossified and unresponsive to the rank and file, particularly as the workforce changed.
Yeah, thank you for that detailed answer. It looks like Josh has his hand raised. Josh, if you
Yeah,
want to
hi
come
Josh,
up.
how you doing?
Hey, how you doing? Thank you for this presentation. It was really,
What
really
can I do for
informative.
you?
Yeah, if you kind of answered a little bit in the last part of your last question, but you know, as you mentioned, like now how you went over unions can't compete with corporations because of the capital differential and the power and all that. But that wasn't always so. As you mentioned, like in the 50s, it was more, the unions were more powerful. So what would you say would be the biggest front or the biggest the best way to change that in contemporary times and now?
That's sort of like the key question that people are grappling for an answer with. And I think a large part of it has to lie in how unions relate to workers. I think that as the workforce has become more diverse, and I'll use the Starbucks case and the Amazon labor unions case as an example. The workforces that they represent are very diverse, and they are very socially conscious. And they have people that are in their leadership positions, like Amazon Labor is led by a young African-American gentleman who worked at the warehousing plant. And this is really a small union, but I think it sets the tone for the change that labor needs to make. It needs to represent the workforce more than the traditional union has, and it needs to be less bureaucratic and more responsive. It needs to be more sophisticated in terms of its use of social media and how it relates to people. And the Amazon workers are adept at that, and the Starbucks workers are as well. And I think that if labor were to take a leaf from the past, there were a number of unions, established unions, that took risks and supported the auto workers in the 1930s when it was a chance. And some people thought it was a long shot. But I think labor has to get behind these indigenous groups, these people that are, these individuals that are rising up in these smaller units and say, there's something we can learn from that. We want to learn from it and see how we can copy it and emulate it elsewhere. And to not waste a whole lot of time. One thing you'll notice what they do is Starbucks, that, they've had a lot of elections, but they don't wait around. Part of the reason is that the units are so small. It's not hard to organize 20 people. It's harder to organize 8,000. But if you can get a petition filed and hold an election right away, you're more likely to win. And I think they really need to get speed on their side, get the message that they're really representing people and they're going to focus on what they want. And it's more than just wages. It's about quality of life. It's about, I think, how they're treated in the workplace, the dignity with which they're treated. At Starbucks, there was a lot of concern about, handling issues associated with the pandemic and, contagious diseases, and they were dissatisfaction with how management responded to that. I think that's a broader issue. But labor unions need to be much more nimble and much more focused and get a better message and get the messenger out there who can actually speak to the workers and have some credibility with them. And that means, you know, you've got to recognize that our workforce is much more international. It's much more in terms of, you know, people from different countries and also from different backgrounds and philosophies and races. And if you don't represent that, then people are going to look and say, I don't see much in this for me. And it's got to be represented in the leadership, people that have power, that make decisions. And I think that goes to the very top. That's the best answer at this time I can give you. I wish I had a better way, you know, but you know, you're gonna have to be willing to fight and take risks, because they will fire you. They will make life miserable for you. They will relocate their jobs. They will close their facilities. I mean, I've been a management consultant. I've seen what companies can and will do. And in their mind, to a great extent, human capital is expendable if they can get it someplace else.
All right, I think we have one more in the chat. Reagan asks, are there sectors in which unions have not been particularly successful? And if so, which ones? What
Well,
factors besides?
I think in more broadly in the service sector, if you look at leisure and hospitality, if you look at financial services, those are very large sectors. Professional services, they have not been nearly successful as I think they could. I think people that work at banks, a lot of them have, I'll be honest with you, what I think are lousy jobs. They are really pushed hard by management. You know, they're considered very, very expendable. I mean, you know, the people that work at the very top of these investment banks, the J.P. Morgans and on down the line, they've got it great. But there are thousands of people that do the daily work whose jobs aren't so great. And I think they could benefit a lot from representation, but they're very hard to penetrate. It's hard to organize a bank. You know, think about it. A bank is not going to look kindly upon a group of union organizers come into their retail outlet and trying to organize the workforce while they're trying to serve the customers. You're going to find yourself thrown out pretty quickly. And so you have to have a different way to reach them. And it'll become clear after a very short period of time that unions are not welcome.
An interesting follow-up question. Wondering if the reason unions don't do well in those industries, could that be due to high turnover in these fields, especially in service and hospitality?
Yes, yes. And when there's such high turnover, it's hard to represent workers. It's hard to, you know, think about it. You got to organize a contract for 20 people. It's going to be a sophisticated contract. What if 15 of those 20 people aren't there by the time you negotiate your first contract? And the people that you have come in, you got to get them into the union. You got to work on getting them to join. And they may have different interests and demands. And they may want to change in leadership. So it's very hard. And a lot of organizations don't want to spend the money to try and represent workers in such high turnover places. So that is a real difficult challenge. Now, one of the things unions try and do is try and stabilize those workforces a little bit and say, you know, if we had better working conditions, you might have a little longer tenure. But a lot of the nature of those jobs is that they are held by college age students, are those that are very transient in the workplace and just using this as a temporary stop on the way to their quote real career.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Anything else I can do to help you with, Nick?
No, I think that was a really good overview, and we had some really good engagement from our attendees.
Well, I
and
appreciate that very much. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to respond or have a conversation offline with you. Don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I wish everybody the best. And thank you again for coming.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you
Take
again.
care, folks.
And yeah, everybody, please look out for the video and the slides coming tomorrow. On behalf of the graduate school, thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
we'll see
Thank
you next
for
time.
setting it up, Nick, and thank you for coming. Take care, folks.
Thanks.